The biggest mistake you can make at a flea market is checking the price tag before you check the case back. True watch scarcity doesn't always wear a luxury logo. Sometimes it wears a government property stamp or a layer of battlefield dust. Today, I'm breaking down 5 vintage watches you can routinely find cheap because they look completely broken or ordinary to an average seller. We are looking at everything from a legendary 44mm jungle dive watch, made famous by Hollywood, to secret Swiss-made prototypes. Here is your ultimate weekend scouting guide. Number 5. Bulova Accutron, the watch that hums instead of ticks. Reach into a pile of dead quartz watches at a flea market table, and every so often you hear something strange. Not a tick. A faint, steady hum, like a tiny bee trapped inside glass. That hum is a Bulova Accutron. And the odd part is this: the watch does not even have a crown on the front. No little knob to twist and set the time. Bulova did that on purpose. Setting the time happens through a tiny knurled roller hidden on the back of the case instead. The pitch to buyers in the 60s was blunt and confident. This watch is accurate enough that you should not need to keep touching it. Under the hood sits caliber 214, a metal tuning fork buzzing 360 times every second, driven by a battery instead of a coiled spring. Bulova's president at the time, General Omar Bradley, unveiled it in October of 1960 as the world's first fully electronic watch. Sales reps loved demonstrating it by holding one up to a customer's ear. People expected silence. What they got instead was that unmistakable hum, and it sold itself on the spot. Governments noticed fast. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson designated Accutron watches as an official gift of state, handed out to visiting dignitaries. 3 years later, they were installed on Air Force One. Test pilots flying experimental aircraft, including the secretive high-altitude program that eventually led to the SR-71 Blackbird, trusted the same tuning fork technology because it kept time through vibration and stress that would throw off an ordinary mechanical balance wheel. NASA leaned on it even harder. Buzz Aldrin, the very astronaut who wore an Omega Speedmaster on the moon's surface, also placed a Bulova-built Accutron timer inside the lunar rover, parked at the Sea of Tranquility. That clock is still there. It will outlast every single watch on this list, probably by a few thousand years. So why does something with this kind of resume turn up cheap at a flea market? Because a silent, crownless watch looks broken to almost anyone who doesn't already know the story. The battery dies eventually, the hum stops, and to an untrained seller, a dead-looking watch with no obvious way to wind it reads as scrap metal wearing a fancy name. People sell mystery for pennies constantly, simply because mystery looks identical to garbage from across a folding table. Bulova actually built these in 2 separate factories, one in the United States and one in Switzerland, and the 2 plants used slightly different case shapes, hand styles, and dial fonts. A buyer who only knows the American T case shape might walk straight past an equally valuable Swiss Alpha case, sitting one table over, simply because it looks unfamiliar. That gap in recognition is worth money, and it rewards the person willing to actually study both versions before ever setting foot at a market. Here is where it gets tricky, though. The most collectible version of this watch, nicknamed the Space View, was originally built with no dial at all, so buyers could watch that tiny fork buzz behind open glass. Bulova only produced a limited number of true factory Space Views before demand outgrew supply. For decades since, people have been popping the solid dials off ordinary Accutrons and selling the open-face result as an original Space View. A flea market seller usually has no idea which version they are holding. Plenty of online buyers do not either. A genuine, untouched Space View in good condition can sell for well over $1,000 today. A converted fake, no matter how clean it looks on camera, is worth a fraction of that, the second an expert checks the caseback serial and compares it against known factory records. So the real flea market lesson buried inside this one is not simply grab any Bulova you see. It is learn to read the tiny year code stamped on the back, an M for the 60s, an N for the 70s, followed by a single digit for the year. That one habit alone is worth more than any amount of luck at a folding table. Bulova kept building these until 1977, selling more than 5 million of them across the model's run, before quartz technology finally made the tuning fork obsolete almost overnight. Think about that scale for a second. 5 million watches, produced across 2 continents, and yet a genuine early space view still counts as rare, simply because so few people who own one realize what they are holding long enough to keep it safe. Picture an actual watchmaker's bench for a moment, not a store counter. A repair specialist who has serviced Accutrons for 30 years can tell you that the tuning fork itself almost never fails. What usually dies first is the tiny transistor circuit driving it, a part that eventually stops being made altogether. So, a hum that goes silent is not necessarily a dead watch. It is very often a watch waiting for one very specific person who still knows how to fix it, and those people are getting harder to find every year. I keep coming back to this one, if I am honest with you. A watch engineered to feel too advanced to even need a crown, sitting quietly in a box next to broken alarm clocks and mismatched cufflinks. Nobody ever bids on a hum. They bid on a name, and only once somebody finally explains what that hum actually means. Drop a guess below. Would you have picked it up? Crown or no crown? That hum is easy to miss at a table covered in costume jewelry, but the next watch on this list does not hum at all. It ticks with the sound of an entire war stamped quietly onto its back. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Number 4. Hamilton W10, the government's own watch. Flip a plain steel watch over at a flea market, and sometimes you find more writing on the back than on the front. Rows of small stamped numbers, a stock code, an issue year, and if you are genuinely lucky, a tiny arrow pointing upward, like someone pressed a miniature spearhead into the metal. That arrow is called a broad arrow, and for centuries it has meant one specific thing across Britain. This object belongs to the government. Put it on a watch, and you are no longer holding a fashion accessory. You are holding actual military equipment. The Hamilton W10 was built for exactly that job. Britain's Ministry of Defense had spent years relying on an older watch called the Smith's W10, made by a British firm of the same era, before finally awarding the newer contract to Hamilton in 1973. From 1973 to 1976, Hamilton supplied a rugged field watch to soldiers, sailors, and pilots across the British Armed Forces. The case uses a one-piece tonneau shape, sealed from the front, since that design keeps water and dust out far better than a standard snapback case. A small circled letter T on the dial marks the glow paint as tritium, which has a half-life of about 12 years and slowly fades from bright green into a warm, creamy patina that collectors now consider a badge of honest age rather than a flaw. Pull the crown out, and the second hand freezes dead in its tracks, a feature called hacking, built specifically so an entire platoon could set every wrist to the exact same second before heading out on a mission together. Because it was built like a small tank, it survived decades of rough handling in a way delicate dress watches never could. Soldiers wore these through patrols in Northern Ireland during some of the tensest years of the Troubles. Others carried them through training drills, brutal enough to destroy an ordinary civilian wristwatch inside a single year. And so, quietly, it kept working, decade after decade, long after the people who first strapped one on had moved on to entirely different lives. Turn one over and the case back tells its own small story if you know how to read it. A stock number, then the code W10 for standard army issue, then a country code, then a serial number paired with the actual year of issue stamped right into the steel. The same basic watch carries a different code depending on which branch carried it. Army issue reads W10. Royal Navy issue reads a different number entirely. Royal Air Force issue carries its own separate marking too. 3 branches, 1 shared design, 3 completely different little codes stamped on the back, and almost nobody at a flea market table has ever learned to tell them apart. It reads almost like a tiny government file clipped to your wrist, decades before anyone thought to digitize any of it. There is a strange irony hiding inside this contract, too. In 1974, right in the middle of supplying Britain's own military watches, Hamilton itself was sold to a Swiss watchmaking group called SSIH. A watch stamped with a British government arrow, built by an American company that had, mid-contract, quietly become Swiss-owned. Nobody buying one at a flea market today has any reason to know that. But it's a detail worth sitting with for a second. By 1976, Hamilton handed the contract over to a much smaller specialist company called CWC, which kept producing the same rugged shape through 1979. Then, as quartz movements took over the industry, a company called Precista introduced a chunkier, battery-powered version nicknamed the Fat Boy in 1982, 13 millimeters thick and unmistakably its own thing. Most people picture that later quartz version when they imagine a military field watch today. The original mechanical Hamilton W10 is rarer, arguably better engineered in a few specific ways, and almost never recognized on sight. It also carries a much older lineage than most buyers assume. Its direct ancestors are the legendary Dirty Dozen, a group of 12 Swiss manufacturers commissioned during the Second World War to build standardized waterproof field watches for British troops, and those wartime originals now sell for serious money among specialist collectors. The W10 is the same military bloodline, one generation later, still hiding at a fraction of the price. Picture a grandfather's old dresser drawer, tarnished cufflinks nobody wears anymore, a worn leather belt. And underneath all of it, this plain, black-dialed watch with a stamped arrow on the back that his grandkids assume is just a manufacturing scratch, not an actual government mark. That single image captures the entire flea market opportunity here. Nothing flashy sits on top. The real story is stamped underneath, exactly where nobody thinks to check. The movement inside, Hamilton's caliber 649, is essentially the same engine used in the American Good Game W113 field watch, issued to United States forces around the same period, running at 21,600 vibrations per hour, with roughly 50 hours of power reserve once fully wound. So, a soldier in the British Army and a soldier in the American Army during the same decade were often carrying near-identical hearts inside their wrists, badged completely differently, priced completely differently today, simply because one case says Hamilton, with a broad arrow, and the other does not. Somewhere, a veteran who served through the mid-70s probably still has one of these tucked in a bedside drawer, worn every single day during service, and then never worn again once civilian life started, because it stopped feeling like it belonged on a wrist that wasn't standing in formation anymore. That is not a sentimental guess. That is simply where a huge number of these watches ended up, and exactly why they keep surfacing decades later at estate sales and flea markets, priced by people who never once asked why a soldier kept it in the first place. I will say this plainly, because it is worth saying out loud. I think the W10 is criminally underpriced right now, and I genuinely do not fully understand why more collectors have not caught on. Watches carrying a fraction of this history routinely sell for 5 times as much, purely because the word Rolex happens to sit somewhere on the dial. That watch survived actual combat conditions and still gets mistaken for a $5 mall kiosk special. The next one has an even stranger disguise problem. It got smuggled somewhere nobody expected, and almost nobody noticed for over 30 years. Number 3. Seiko, the chronograph that beat everyone to space. Here is a number worth memorizing: $64. That is what a young Air Force officer paid for a watch in September of 1972 at a small exchange store on an air base outside Houston. Hold on to that number. It matters again before this list is finished. His name was Colonel William Pogue, and he needed a reliable chronograph to train for an upcoming NASA mission. The official mission watch, an Omega Speedmaster, had not been issued to him yet, so he trained with his own Seiko instead, a yellow-dialed automatic chronograph bought on a simple payment plan. When it finally came time to launch aboard the Skylab 4 mission in November of 1973, he brought both watches along, just in case one failed. For 84 days in orbit, Pogue used that Seiko to time thruster burns and onboard experiments, quietly making horological history that nobody outside the mission noticed at the time. The watch performed flawlessly the entire flight. This entire story stayed buried until 2006, when a collector researching old chronograph photographs pieced it together from mission imagery. The moment the story broke publicly, prices for these Seikos jumped almost overnight, and an entire cottage industry of part sellers appeared within months. The watch itself, reference 6139, earns its place here on engineering alone. It was built around the world's first vertical clutch inside an automatic chronograph, a small mechanical trick that let the stopwatch function engage far more smoothly than the horizontal clutch systems most Swiss brands were still using at the time. The lead engineer, Toshihiko Oki, had already designed the earlier caliber 61 movement that would go on to power Seiko's respected Grand Seiko chronographs. The 6139 debuted in 1969, the exact same year as Zenith's famous El Primero, quietly beating several far more celebrated Swiss names to a race almost nobody at the time realized was even happening. The same family tree also produced a whole rainbow of dial colors. Most people never connect to the space story at all. A blue-dialed version earned the nickname Sievert, after a French Formula One driver who wore one before his death in 1973. A black-dialed variant became known among collectors as the Bruce Lee, after evidence surfaced that the actor wore one himself. None of these carry the exact yellow dial that flew on Skylab, but they share the same movement, the same engineering breakthroughs, and, in most cases, a noticeably lower price tag than the famous yellow version, simply because their stories are quieter. The case itself carries small clues too, if you know to look. Early production models have a slight notch near the crown, a detail collectors simply call the notch case, while later runs smooth that shape away entirely. Spotting that one tiny notch, or its absence, tells you roughly when your particular watch rolled off the line, years before you ever check a single serial number. So why does a genuinely space-flown design still turn up cheap at flea market tables? Because collectors argue endlessly over which exact reference deserves the nickname Pogue. Purists insist only a 6139 to 6005, stamped with the words Water 70M, resist on the dial, can properly wear that name. Pogue's actual personal watch was technically a 6139 to 6002, a closely related but slightly different reference. Everyday sellers online use the nickname loosely for any yellow dial from the era, which means most watches labeled Pogue for sale are not the reference collectors consider correct. That constant confusion works in a patient bargain hunter's favor. A flea market seller who has never once heard the word Pogue is not pricing space history. They are simply pricing an old, slightly beat-up Japanese watch from the 70s, priced somewhere between roughly $500 and $1,000 depending on condition, and that price gap is exactly where a knowledgeable buyer gets to walk straight in. Which detail from this one sticks with you the most? There is something almost funny about it, if you sit with it long enough. A watch, trusted to time actual rocket thrusters, got dragged into an endless internet argument over which specific dial print counts as correct. Being technically disputed turned out to be the very thing that kept the price low enough for patient collectors to keep finding honest examples for years afterward. And here's a small detail worth knowing before we move on. Pogue himself was not just any astronaut. He later became known, half-jokingly, as the first person to go on strike while in space, after asking mission control for less scheduled work and more time simply to look out the window. A watch bought for $64 ended up strapped to the wrist of a man who briefly refused to keep working on one of humanity's most expensive missions ever flown. That is not the kind of detail you get from a spec sheet. It is the kind of detail that makes an entire chronograph reference feel like a person's actual life, instead of just a string of numbers on a caseback. One space chronograph slipping past unnoticed is one thing, but the next watch on this list has a family name so famous, people assume it must be fake just because the price sitting on the table is too low to be real. Number 2, the family name everyone doubts. Say the word Rolex out loud at a flea market table and watch what happens to people's faces. Eyes light up first. Then, within about 3 seconds, they narrow with pure suspicion. Everyone has heard the price tag attached to that name. Nobody genuinely expects to find one sitting in a cardboard box. So when a real Rolex-made case, a real Rolex crown, and sometimes a real Rolex bracelet all turn up on a watch that never once says Rolex anywhere on the dial, most people assume the entire thing must be a cheap knockoff wearing a real name badge for no honest reason. That instinct is understandable. It is also, in this one very specific case, completely backwards. In 1926, Rolex founder Hans Wilsdorf created a second, quieter brand called Tudor. The idea was refreshingly simple. Build watches to the exact same demanding standard as Rolex, using the same cases, the same water-resistant oyster technology, but fit them with less expensive movements sourced from outside suppliers, so the final retail price came down for everyday buyers. For decades, Tudor watches genuinely used Rolex parts. Flip one of these vintage Tudor Oyster Prince models over, and you can sometimes read the words "Original Oyster Case" by Rolex Geneva, stamped directly into the steel. The crown itself often still carries the Rolex logo, not a Tudor one at all. And yet, because the dial says Tudor instead of Rolex, plenty of people assume the whole watch has to be a fake, dressed up in borrowed parts. It's the exact opposite situation. The parts are completely genuine. Only the movement inside, sourced from outside suppliers like ETA and Valjoux, and the name printed on the face, were built to a lower price point on purpose, by the very same company, using the very same tooling and cases. But that outside movement was never a downgrade in the way people assume. Watchmakers who service both brands from this era will tell you that Tudor calibers held their timing just as well as the equivalent Rolex movements of the same decade, sometimes running for years between services, with barely any drift at all. The difference was never about how well the watch worked. It was only ever about which name Rolex decided to print on which dial, aimed at which customer's budget. Collectors even nicknamed some later Tudor chronograph variants, things like the home plate, thanks to unusual pentagon-shaped hour markers, and the Monte Carlo, thanks to bold racing-inspired dial colors, proof that this was never a boring budget line quietly copying its parent company. It had its own personality the entire time. One particular 3/8mm version, nicknamed the Jumbo by collectors, decades after it left the factory, wears noticeably larger and more modern on the wrist than its 3/4mm siblings, which means it slides comfortably onto a modern buyer's wrist without feeling like a shrunken antique, something few other watches from that era can honestly claim. Prices for these vintage Tudor Oyster Prince models today average somewhere around $2,000, according to current market tracking, with the full range stretching from roughly $500 up toward $5,000, depending heavily on condition, dial, and whether original Rolex stamped parts remain intact. Compare that to a vintage Rolex from the exact same era, wearing the literal same case shape, and you're often looking at a difference of tens of thousands of dollars for what amounts to a different name printed on the dial and a different, still perfectly reliable engine ticking away underneath. Tudor put its own toughness on display decades ago, too, well before any marketing team decided to make a slogan out of it. Small teams of Tudor oyster princes went along on a North Greenland expedition, kept running through brutal cold, and came home having proven the same water resistance and reliability Rolex was famous for at a fraction of the cost of sending an actual Rolex into that kind of environment. Reference numbers like 7,000, 995, and 7,387 turn up regularly in vintage listings today. And the honest ones, the untouched ones with original dials and unpolished cases, are exactly the pieces worth learning to spot before you ever set foot at a table. Here's the part that never stops feeling strange to me: the brand people trust. The least standing at a flea market table is sometimes the brand holding the most verified Rolex parts in its hand, in plain sight, the entire time. Somebody's grandmother probably mentioned a Rolex adjacent watch her father wore fishing every single summer. One, nobody in the family ever bothered getting appraised because everyone simply assumed it was costume jewelry mixed in among the real gold rings. That exact drawer full of wrong assumptions is sitting in far more houses than most people realize. A trusted name doing all the hard work of hiding in plain sight. Now, picture that same exact trick. Except this time the watch didn't just hide from strangers at a table. It hid on a soldier's wrist through an entire war, and then on a movie screen for 50 years after that. Number 1. Seiko reference 6105. The watch a movie made famous without naming it. Remember that $64 Seiko from a few minutes ago? Its older sibling is the entire reason this next watch earns the very top spot on this list. Picture a riverboat pushing slowly through dense jungle fog in a war movie. Martin Sheen plays Captain Willard, and strapped to his wrist through nearly the whole film sits a chunky black dive watch nobody in the script ever names out loud. Fans spent years afterward hunting down exactly what model it was. The answer turned out to be a Seiko reference, 6105, produced between 1968 and 1970, 44 millimeters across, rated for use 150 meters underwater, with a rotating dive bezel and a case shape unlike anything Swiss brands were building at the time. This was never a prop picked purely for looks. Real American servicemen actually wore these in Vietnam, because they were tough, genuinely accurate, and available for a fraction of the price of a comparable Swiss dive watch, at a moment when a steel Rolex Submariner cost roughly the equivalent of a month's military pay, and a Seiko cost closer to a week's. So when the film crew needed something that looked like it truly belonged on a soldier's wrist in that exact war, they reached for a watch that had, in fact, already earned that place. Collectors have nicknamed it the Willard ever since, borrowing the character's name rather than any word Seiko ever printed on the dial itself. The earliest version of this case, reference 6105 to 8000, arrived in 1968 with slightly different proportions before Seiko refined it into the now iconic 6105 to 8110 that appears on screen. That wide, cushioned case shape, complete with a rotating bezel, later became the direct engineering ancestor of the very chronograph movement that powered the space-flown Seiko from earlier in this list. Same engineering family, developed by the same company within a few years of each other. Two completely different destinies branched off from one shared design. One went into a war zone deep in the jungle. The other went into orbit 270 miles above the Earth. Neither one ever needed a famous crest or a celebrity endorsement to earn its story. And that's exactly why this watch tops the entire list. It does not lean on a Swiss crown, a president's official gift, or a lucky Hollywood casting choice to matter. It leans on the plain fact that real people wore it, doing real, genuinely dangerous work, and a filmmaker later recognized that truth clearly enough to hand it to a leading character without ever once needing to say its name out loud. Today, an honest example in decent original condition sells for somewhere between roughly $1,500 and $3,500, depending heavily on how original the dial, hands, and bezel insert remain. At a flea market, though, a seller who has never watched that particular movie or never connected a battered old dive watch to one specific unforgettable scene will simply see a scratched-up Seiko with a sticky bezel and a fogged crystal. That exact gap between what the watch actually is and what it merely looks like sitting on a folding table is the entire reason this whole list exists in the first place. Ask around long enough and you will still meet people whose father or uncle actually served in Vietnam wearing one of these on a rubber strap, long before anyone had ever heard the name Captain Willard attached to it. For them, the movie came second. The watch came first, strapped on during real days that had nothing to do with a film script. Seiko itself eventually noticed how much collectors still cared, releasing modern tribute reissues of this exact case shape decades later, official proof that a design built for soldiers in the jungle never really needed a movie to justify its own existence in the first place. So, somewhere out there right now, in a box of loose watches nobody has properly sorted through, a 44mm case sits quietly waiting for someone who actually remembers what a jungle riverboat looked like on a movie screen 50 years ago, and who knows enough to check the caseback numbers before walking away. Which one of these 5 would you actually stop and dig through an entire box to find? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe.